It's Tuesday, September the 5th, 2023. Let us gather together and experience the goodness of God. I'm Pastor Trey and Pastor Emily. We begin with our scripture of the week, Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, and a piece entitled by me, A Tale of at least two MacGuffins. Then I will be joined by Pastor Emily Larson to talk scripture and how to beat the great pastor resignation. But first, a reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up and out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites. The cry of Israel has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they will ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations. Exodus contains at least a couple of MacGuffins. The prolific filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock had a particular fondness for the term and popularized it. A MacGuffin is an object that can get a story going, but isn't particularly significant in and of itself. It's the Maltese Falcon of Maltese Falcon fame. In Star Wars terms, the Death Star isn't a MacGuffin. It's too important. R2-D2 is the MacGuffin. Protecting him and getting him to the rebellion drives the plot of A New Hope, but in the end, he's just a common astromech droid that everyone happens to be looking for. The Holy Grail of Arthurian legend, Monty Python, and Indiana Jones fame is one of literature's great MacGuffins. We have so many quests to find it, but the result of the quests seldom match the effort. We get a lot of, it's just a cup, or it's unfindable, or it's not a physical object at all. No matter the actual outcome, the quest for the Grail matters far more than the actual drinking vessel. One of Exodus's MacGuffins even gets a starring role in Indiana Jones. The Ark of the Covenant. The Ark drives so much of the plot of the second half of Exodus, Joshua, Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. We get into how to house the Ark, who can approach the Ark, when can you approach the Ark, how will the Ark cross into the Promised Land, how will the Ark get rescued from the Philistines, and who can build a final home for the Ark, aka the Temple. However, in and of itself, it's just a fancy box containing some tablets. With the destruction of the first temple and the exile, it disappears from the story, but the worship of God continues. Of course, until Indian Company find it in the 1940s and we store it in the Smithsonian. We get the other great MacGuffin of Exodus here at the burning bush, the staff of Moses/Aaron. The conversation between God and Moses goes on for 2 whole chapters, Exodus 3 and 4. Moses, clearly nervous about going before a near godlike human to demand things, keeps pushing God for more assistance. He gets the staff as a result. As it says in Exodus chapter 4, verses 2 through 5. The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." And he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw the staff on the ground, and it became a snake, and Moses drew back from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out your hand and seize it by the tail." So he reached out his hand and grasped it, and it became a staff in his hands. After Moses takes on the mission of freeing God's people, the staff, now wielded by Aaron, performs for Pharaoh just as God described, and gets a minor role in initiating the turning the Nile to blood and the plague of gnats. When God's people arrive at the edge of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army close at hand, the staff gets its most iconic moment, as described in Exodus chapter 14, verses 15 and 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground." We get the key image of Moses, staff in hand, parting a sea and putting it back right on top of Pharaoh's army. In Numbers chapter 20, where Moses gets so frustrated with God and God's people that God disinvites him to the promised land, Moses strikes the offending rock with the staff. Much like R2-D2 weaving his way through every mainline Star Wars film, the staff keeps making a great MacGuffin because it keeps showing up at pivotal moments to help push the plot forward. It's also just a stick of wood outside of its involvement in the grand drama of a contest between God and Pharaoh. It has no innate relevancy. When God appears to Moses, Moses works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. Of course, he, and any other self-respecting shepherd, would have a staff with him. As an ordinary rod from a tree, it has no inherent magic. We don't believe in magic items. The bit about the Ark being able to zap Nazis is nowhere in the Bible. The Ark is just a pretty box, and the staff is just a normal shepherd's tool. Their plot-driving power stems from their ability to point out the power and presence of God. The Ark forms the base of the mercy seat, or the earthly location of God's presence. We care about the box because God uses the box as a chair to have manifestation in the realm of mortals. When the Levites approach the box with fear for their lives, gilded wood has nothing to do with it. They rightly fear the unstoppable creator of the universe who uses the box as an earthly throne. The staff serves as a pointer to show the directionality of God's power. By giving the name of God there at the burning bush, God commits God's power to the freeing of God's people. This is what's happening in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." Moses and the cause of liberating God's people from slavery constitute the first use of God's full name, and thus full power, in protection of God's people. The MacGuffin of the staff merely highlights what God does to overcome Pharaoh, who believed himself to be a god. In this way, even Moses, the great prophet, is perhaps himself merely a MacGuffin. He's just a man doing the talking. Seeking, calling, and having a human as voice box drives the plot forward. But the plot is about the power of God doing the defeating of Pharaoh, not the work of a mere mortal. God stars in Exodus, with Moses, staff, and ark as supporting cast. God's the hero. Pharaoh's the villain. Everyone else is a plot-driving MacGuffin. So I'm not sure I meant to do movie bits 2 weeks in a row, but that's just what happened. Last week, it was Ocean's 11. This week, it was largely Raiders of the Lost Ark. Framed, you know. My dad who had listened to the sermon, I made a small Raiders of the Lost Ark joke in the sermon. My dad was like, hey, you didn't bring up, we do know where the Ark of the Covenant is. I'm like, oh, no, don't worry. I got you, bro. Watch the other thing. Watch the other thing. Wait for the podcast. I talk about the fact that the Ark of the Covenant is in the Smithsonian, and that it is able to zap Nazis.
Because of course it is. Because Indiana Jones proved that.
Proves that it's in the, the Holy Grail's not there, but it did heal Sean Connery.
Right.
And again, like a weird amount of Indiana Jones in this week's content. I did, again, this was not, I don't plan these like week to week. I plan the scriptures in advance and the topics, but I have no idea what I'm going to write until I sit down to write it. And this week it was about like MacGuffins, but the MacGuffins, the merely point to what God is doing. And then the sermon kind of, takes that and runs, actually, the sermon ends up taking the whole arc of the Old and New Testament is all about God's presence with God's people, right? And this whole thing about this journey in Exodus is not about what did Moses do. It's about the presence and power of God abiding with God's people. And where the presence and power abiding with God's people shows up isn't actually with the tablets coming down. That's merely sealing the deal. That's merely giving words to the covenant. The actual, God abiding with God's people shows up here in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, but here in 1 through 15, in where we get the aptly, a name with enough theological weight, the Tetragrammaton, right?
Got to use the Tetragrammaton to get your seminary education word in there for this podcast.
It's on the bingo card. The Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name that ends up becoming the sermon version of this, which is also on our YouTube channel. YouTube.com/servantsnow, frames a lot of this is all about the presence of God. And this is, we showed it in worship. We showed a clip from The Prince of Egypt, a movie that I frankly like, have always liked, but theologically it's horrific. Now it's a DreamWorks film rather than, whatever. So fine, but it does the thing that we all do. We like superheroes, and so we frame it as like a hero's journey. It's not, right? The Exodus is not a hero's journey. Moses is just another MacGuffin, right? To move the plot along. He is like a stand-in for the audience. He is just essentially watching what God is doing. God's the hero of the story.
Just don't tell that to the people at DreamWorks or to Charlton Heston, all of the Ten Commandments. You got to have the hero's journey story. But you're right, it's the MacGuffin. They are all just character devices used to promote the real story, which is this presence of God coming down to be with God's people.
Well, right. And they all lose, one of the things that they talk about with the technical of a MacGuffin is the MacGuffin has to eventually lose significance, right? Eventually, R2-D2, which, by the way, that's official. George Lucas declared R2-D2 a MacGuffin.
He's my favorite MacGuffin, though. He's my favorite of all time.
So this is where George Lucas and Alfred Hitchcock disagree with one another. Alfred Hitchcock believes that the audience should not care about a MacGuffin. And George Lucas is on record saying, no, you should care about that MacGuffin. That MacGuffin's name is R2. But at some point, R2 is there, but the narrative is so much bigger than R2-D2, right? In the same way that the staff is there and the ark is there and Moses is there, but then they all recede in the background, right? Moses doesn't make it into the promised land. This was never about Moses, right? Moses dies. We have talked about. I have talked about why. It's in Numbers 20, but in the past year, even bring it up in the piece. But Moses doesn't get into the promised land,
right?
He's just another MacGuffin. We want the hero. Okay, cool. You've got the hero. We just missed the hero.
Because the actual hero here is God's presence coming in. Is I am, right?
It's I am, right. It is this was one of, a lot of seminary felt, is what it is, right? But we, in my, first year of seminary, my Dr. Lemon, my Old Testament professor, really went after the Prince of Egypt, right? Part of my shtick is I learned it from you. I learned it from Dr. Lemon at Candler. There's the song, the Mariah Carey song after there can be miracles when you believe, which is fine. There also can be miracles when you don't believe. It has
when
nothing
you don't
to do
believe.
It has nothing.
It's really
to do
not
with
up to you.
It's not up to you. But the actual line he hates is, "Who knows what miracles we can achieve when we believe?" To which he goes, "They achieved nothing."
They really didn't do anything. It was not up to the people of God. It was up to God.
Right. The stick is in Moses' hand. I get it. But Moses didn't part the Red Sea. And I've been guilty of saying the phrase, Moses parts the Red Sea. Moses does not part the Red Sea.
Right.
God parts the Red Sea. Moses doesn't defeat Pharaoh. God defeats Pharaoh. This is not a hero's journey. This is a contest between gods. Right? And I don't want to, I'm not going down a weird polytheism route, I promise. Egyptian pharaohs declared themselves man gods in the same way that Roman emperors did, right? Or the same way that Louis XIV essentially did. It's a really great shtick if you can, instead of working for religion, declare yourself the religion. As a man who went on to found a religion said, "You want to become a billionaire, start your own religion." That man started Scientology. He died a billionaire. No, he didn't die. He's coming back. He's on a mission.
Exactly.
I'm sorry. L. Ron Hubbard is not dead. He is on a mission, right?
Sure.
As L. Ron Hubbard proved. You want to die or not die a billionaire? Where's Shelley? If you want to die a billionaire, found your own religion. So that's essentially what the Egyptian pharaohs did, right? L. Ron Hubbard didn't make up this idea.
So this is truly a story of Yahweh versus Pharaoh, right? This is Battle of the Titans.
It's the Battle of the Titans. And much like, we talked about a few weeks back with Elijah versus Baal, the priests of Baal. This is another one. This is the prototype, right? Because Elijah's much, much later, 1,000 years later.
But even then, it's not Elijah doing the thing. This is God doing the thing through Elijah, right?
Elijah's the prophet's the mouthpiece, right?
Right.
That's the thing. The prophet is just a talking MacGuffin, like R2-D2 is a talking MacGuffin. They're more articulate, although R2 can say a lot.
And does.
Right.
And is comically translated by C-3PO.
Right. Well, that is one of my favorite tropes in movies is the character that everyone on screen understands, but you do not. And so that is Chewbacca and R2.
Yes.
And that's the amazing Yin in the Oceans movies. Right?
Yes.
He only ever speaks in largely speaks in Chinese. And then everyone just understands, everyone on the Oceans team just speaks Chinese, which I find very inclusive. But he is R2-D2 and Chewbacca, the character that everyone knows, but you do not.
Yep.
Yeah, it is that this is the archetype for the mouthpiece is showing you something. And we like to latch on to the character we can identify with because we cannot ourselves identify with God. That's the point of Jesus, right? That is not the mover and shaker. Leap forward to Jesus, by the way, also a contest between gods. It's Jesus versus the Roman emperor.
Yep.
Right? We don't tell that story that way, right? Except that is, to me, what is happening. But this
at that time in history. Mm-hmm.
At that time, it is really Jesus doing it because he's Emmanuel, God among us.
Yes.
A lot of if you think of the parallels, right, between Jesus and Moses, one of the things that the gospel writers are trying to tell you is hey, we're doing a Moses again, but more so. And how are we doing a Moses again, but more so? It is this time the person who's doing the talking isn't a MacGuffin. He is actually the presence of God with us.
He's actually the hero of the story.
He's actually the hero of the story. And so that's why these are Greek biographies. These are a hero's journey. They are, but that is because Jesus is more than a vessel who stops being important midway through the story. He is the story. He is God among us. Here, he is given the divine name, which, as Harry Potter taught us, fear of a name inspires fear of a thing. In this case, it is there is power in names, right? J.K. Rowling didn't make that up. That is, ancient, because to have the name of something is to have a piece of their power. You can direct that name. That's why we don't take the Lord's name in vain. As I said in the sermon, it's not about not swearing in front of your grandmother. By all means, swear in front of your grandmother. Have fun. That's between you and your grandmother.
Don't, because that's, not polite, but
that's
between
not
you
what
and your grandma.
There's not a 10 commandment about not swearing in front of your grandmother, right? It is, don't misdirect this incredible power that you've been given by having the divine name. That's what it means to not take the Lord's name in vain.
I love that the naming of something can give you part of its power. That's the same concept of have you ever heard, when people make inappropriate jokes to women, if you ask them to explain it to them, then it loses its power because it's not funny.
Right, yeah.
Right, because it's not actually funny. It's the same. Have you watched the Barbie movie yet?
No, I haven't. I've heard amazing things. I chose Oppenheimer.
I still need to go see Oppenheimer.
I had, and this is probably this is probably like where there's a male-female divide if you run this math, right? I will tell you, they both are going to make like $1 billion. Shout outs to both of those movies.
Yes.
No, I chose
Barbie's beating out Oppenheimer right now.
As it should. Again, I really enjoyed. I had the opportunity to see Oppenheimer in 70 millimeter IMAX while I was on our trip to Dallas, and so I picked one, and I didn't pick wrong, but I do need to see Barbie. Anyways, Barbie.
You do, because Barbie does a lot of the same thing of naming the things, right? To name the patriarchy, to, in Barbie land, they have, like a lawyer that says, I can hold logic and emotion at the same time, and that makes me stronger for it.
Right.
Things that you're like, yes, exactly. Or, you get to be a person just because you get to exist, right? Like, there's very good themes in the Barbie movie, but it's because it names the thing, right? So it gives the power because it names the thing. And so this is just a good example of, so we've been given the name of God here, which is the power, right? In whose power do you go to Pharaoh, Moses? Well, you go in mine.
Right.
God's, I am, right?
And it's not, and again, this is not a gift that anyone else had been given to this point, right? No one else gets this name. This is one of those really crucial biblical turning points that we teach badly because we take all of the weight out of it. I suspect, I don't actually know this, but I suspect just my own lived experience that most Christians don't know God's name, right? Yeah. Most Christians have made it through however many decades and they don't actually know what God's name is. They just think, God's name is God. And then they get really mad when people say Allah, which is just God in Arabic.
Which is just God,
it's just God. By the way, Arabic speaking Christians pray to Allah.
Allah, yes.
In the same way that we pray to God, people in Spanish pray to Dios, whatever, right?
Right.
That most people don't know that, they don't know the name of God and they don't know that Jesus is named Joshua, right? These are just things that we have, and we lose something. When we lose a piece of God's power by not understanding that God has a name, right? And a name that, can be traced back into, there were Canaanite people thinking about Yahweh before Abraham. This is a name that exists before this kind of hinge point, 3,500 years ago. This name was out there. They weren't real sure, who this entity was. Was Yahweh a storm god? We got a lot of sky stuff, and so was this like a storm god? And and as you watch Canaanite into Hebrew into Israelite culture develop, it becomes clear that there's one God. That one God is named Yahweh, because Yahweh gave that name to Moses, and we become the people. We God's people become the carriers of this name.
But it's so much easier to focus on the bright, shiny, burning bush than it is to focus on what's actually really happening here, which is the power of God's name coming to Moses.
Coming to Moses.
Being gifted to Moses by God.
And thus, we are watching that God is going to deck Pharaoh. Right? Yep. It is an action movie. It is God v. Pharaoh. And God wins handily. Right? This is the end of the story where there's all these chariots, which are the stealth fighters of the ancient world, and there's part of Egyptian military dominance was chariot driven. They had this amazing technology that this ragtag group of recently former slaves just don't have. There's a lot of them, but they don't have anything. They've got unleavened bread. We're gonna pelt them with pita. What are we gonna do? And Moses waves a stick. God parts a sea, and then crashes that sea back down on Pharaoh.
Did you know that we are still using measurements from chariots?
I did, actually.
Yes. Like train tracks and chariots. The story between the stair steps between chariots and train tracks.
No, but I do. But by all means, explain it. Explain it for people.
So, Roman chariots become Roman roads. Ruts become Roman roads. Roman roads become, basically the parallels between what makes I forget what the actual metric size of our
presumably
train track
it's a meter, right?
No, it's 2 points. It's whatever 2 horses are.
Right.
2 horses could fit, and so that's where your wheel wells were, and so that's where the ruts were in the road, and so that's when Roman roads got perfected, was for the chariot, and that's what continued on for commerce and trade, and now our current modern day train tracks are still 2 horse widths.
2 horse widths apart. Uh-huh.
Yep. Crazy.
Turns out. And that's a foot is standardized. I forget who it was, but it's standard off of some king's foot. And it used to be that a foot would change, and then eventually it got standardized, but it was literally someone's foot. There was someone who is the ideal foot.
Metrics are weird, man.
They're really weird, right? And you understand that 100 degrees Celsius is boiling point. So they wanted that when they're coming up with Celsius, they thought that boiling point should be
100.
Which should be 100, right?
And freezing is 0.
Freezing is 0, okay. And so Fahrenheit, I believe they were trying to capture, they were trying to capture human body temp as 100. Now, this is a long time ago. That's really variable, right? But they were trying to do human, so you just have to, you have to draw a line somewhere, right? These are not, and this is there's this whole very strange field of study that is trying to objectively define measurement, right? So what is a foot objectively? And so it's usually how many atoms of this at this temperature, right? I'm gonna make how many atoms of titanium at 72 degrees Celsius.
Right.
And that's a foot, right? How do you atomically define a foot? And then they're how do you atomically define a second? It all gets it's the X percentage of this half-life, because it was all just stick your finger in the wind. How big is the king's foot?
Or cubits, from elbow to wrist, right?
Yes.
Whose elbow, whose wrist?
The king's.
Cubits. Weird stuff,
feet,
man.
Yards. This is anyways.
Whose yard is 3 feet?
Whose yard is 3 feet?
Whatever.
And it's all ludicrous. But yeah, so it turns out that like with these chariots, back to chariots.
These
chariots are like incredibly powerful technology and will remain so for another 1,000 years. And God just wipes them out, right? And so the larger point I have been trying to make with this, and it is like every preacher probably preaches like 5 things in rotation, and this is one of my top 5, is, hey, this thing that we do has a lot of power behind it. It turns out, right? Like we are perpetually guilty of making our problems huge and God small. Right? And that is the crew in Exodus, guilty of this over and over again, right? But back to Moses and the stick, right? Like they get to the edge of the Red Sea. The plagues have already happened. We've seen blood and gnats and death and
frogs and boils and death
and all this. And so they've already seen some like real fireworks, right? And they get to the edge of the Red Sea and they go, what? We could have just died in our houses. What are we going to do? We're just going to die? And again, they see their problems as too big and God as too small. And then, Moses points a stick. Moses reports to God, hey, we're screwed. We've got a real problem. It's real bad. And God says, no, it's fine. Watch this.
And the thing is that they're looking at a representation. I mean, they've got the pillar of fire. They've got the cloud. They've watched these. It's easy to look at them and go, what were they thinking? How did they not believe that God could get them through or around or defeat Pharaoh's army?
Sure.
Because they'd already seen all the plagues, because they'd already seen the power of God in all of these different manifestations over however much time. And they're looking at a pillar and a cloud and fire, and they're still sitting there at the edge of the Red Sea going, well, woe is me, guess we're going to die now.
And let's be clear, they keep doing it. Like one of the refrains in Exodus is, and this is the most realistic thing in Exodus, it's just no matter how many times, this is what leads to Moses in the waters of Meribah getting wildly frustrated with everyone and not getting the promised land. Because once again, they're like, are we going to die? No, here's water. Have you seen the rest of this movie? Let me play it for you. Charlton Heston does a great job.
Yes.
Right, or they build the golden calf because Moses is taking too long. Right. So this is not actually on them. This is all of us, right? We, just as we have had the divine name for this long, we have underestimated its power for this long.
Yes.
And we should probably stop. Right? Because God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, who, went on a cross, died and came back, who sent the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, is still here. And that's the same entity.
Yes. God still got this.
Right.
It's a good reminder for all of us when we sit there and go, woe is me. Whatever our problem is. And most of us are not enslaved by an Egyptian pharaoh.
Right. Or being chased by 1,000 chariots.
Right. Our problems are minuscule, right? Compared to some of these bigger things that we see. Most of us are not facing slavery and death and destruction. Some of us are in a real way, facing death, facing different challenges in our lives. But God still got this, no matter what that is, no matter what your Egyptian chariots are in your life, God still got this. God still got you.
Right. And we make every generation thinks it's the end of time, right? Thinks they live in the worst time. Right. In one of my favorite series titles ever, I talk about it with some frequency. Go to facebook.com/Palestine Grace. You might be able to still find Sure Looks Like the End Times.
You can.
I guess it's on YouTube as well. So I did this series on Revelation. It's the middle of the pandemic. But as we'll talk about in the next segment, we had to go back to work. And I wrote this series where we did a 12-week study of Revelation called Sure Looks Like the End Times.
Right.
And what you realize is that everyone always thinks that they live in the worst era. And what Revelation wants to remind you is, yeah, probably not. It always kind of looks like the end times out there.
Right.
But part of that is because every generation seems to end up convinced, as our Israelite friends in the desert did, that their problems are finally the ones that God can't overcome. The most recent whatever is secularization, the secular world. It's this church
postmodern and
postmodernism.
Whatever.
It's just church is just going to decline until it dies. Well, with that attitude, you're darn right. Yes, with that attitude, I guess God is dead, right? Like in some ways, this is what Nietzsche meant when he says God is dead, and we killed it, right? Because we act like God is so small,
and like God does not still have the power that God had when God parted the Red Sea.
Right, like there is not Old Testament God and New Testament God, right? That's Marcionism. That was declared a heresy. It's not two entities, it's one. And God didn't stop being powerful at the advent of the motor car or the nuclear bomb or the internet or whatever, or TikTok, the godless wasteland. It is not a godless wasteland. There are no godless wastelands, right?
Right.
God did. This is, I always appreciate how realistic both testaments are of people, right?
Yes, that it still shows humanity's worst, all of our doubts, all of our fears. Yeah. There's nothing new. We have the same doubts. We have the same fears. We have the same worries. We have all of the same human frailties that the Egyptians did, that the Israelites did throughout the Old Testament, that the disciples did in the time of Jesus. When you see them falter, when you see them fail, when you see them doubt, when you see them look at God and go, well, I guess God's not going to get us out of this one. But yet God does.
And yet every time God does, right? Yes. And so this is, if you find yourself in a doubting place, you're in good company, including Moses, right? You see some of this in this text. He's standing there, the bush is burning, the voice of God is speaking, and he's like, yeah, I don't know. Right, and this keeps going, for the whole chapter and a half. For chapters 3 and 4 are him going, you sure? Okay, I'll give you your brother to help you. Are you sure? Take the stick! And then God hits Moses in the head with his walking stick. No,
with a literal stick.
With a literal stick, right? So you even see it here with Moses. But in the end, that power that Moses got never went away. It never did. It's still here. The power and presence of God is still here. Looks different, moves different, no doubt. But it's that same God and that same power. That's as good a place as any to call this segment a segment. And move on to our next segment that we call How to Restart a Church. We're going to take a quick break. After some very rousing theme music, we're going to talk about church post-pandemic and the great pastor resignation. We will be right back. And we're back to talk about church restarting. And actually, in this case, to talk about some of the key things that are happening. So I'm going to have to look down at my notes because there are things I need to say correctly. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research put out a study. We're going to have this in the show notes. There's a Religion News Service article kind of summarizing their findings. But it was basically this research project looked at over 4,000 churches. And it's a 5-year study to try and see what has been the impact of the pandemic on American religion, right? Like on American churches. And because we talk about this anecdotally and Emily and I have been on the business for long enough that we were working together at a church during the start of the pandemic. And what's interesting about this study is it basically says that largely we're back. Largely, we are back to more or less the problems we had pre-pandemic. This year, giving is up 25% from where it was in 2020. The average church size is back to more or less pre-pandemic levels. Some churches are even growing a little more than they were pre-pandemic. Like, you can slice these numbers a little bit, but basically like things are on the upswing in terms of giving especially, but even church attendance let's remember, it wasn't like there was some glory days of church attendance happening in 2020, in February of 2020. Some of us were having a little better time. But generally speaking, religiosity was on the decline. Those trends still exist. But what the pandemic did to churches seems to largely be coming out in the wash. People are coming back to church. Pretty much everyone's back in person. In person seems to be a mixture of in person with an online option seems to be the way to go. And so, again, I don't want to dig too deep in these percentages, but essentially looking at 4,000 churches across 58 denominations, oversampling 20 of the major denominations. Largely speaking, things are back to normal. What they were pre-pandemic. We lived through this thing, and individual church experience may be different. Certainly, actually, I was about to say our church is smaller. That's wrong. Our church is far bigger than it was pre-pandemic because our Spanish service, we're going to do the 3rd anniversary of our Spanish service this Sunday. I'm preaching in Spanish. I'm mildly terrified. It's only the 3rd time in my life I've preached in Spanish.
You got this.
I've got something, and they're very nice to me. Pastor General, that's the senior pastor in Spanish. They're very nice to me. I wave a lot. I smile a lot. I'm the tech guy who does the benediction, and is apparently in charge, although doesn't look it. Anyways. So our church would fit neatly into this. Our giving is not up 25%. But we are largely, it's almost entirely a different set of people. But yeah, so we're back. Except pastors are not back. We're not back.
Are not back and are not coming back. You see this called the Great Resignation of pastors.
So I'm going to give some of their numbers. That in 2021, here we go. No, never mind. Anyways, in 2021, something like 2/3 of pastors had never thought about leaving. In 2023, and this data point would be from May of 2023, only 49% of pastors had never thought about leaving, right? A lot more of us have thought about leaving this field. Even now that things are back, pastors are now even still at higher rates than when things were actually bad. Things were worse than they are. Right, things are better. Things are not good. Religiosity on the decline. Okay, so that makes all of our jobs were hard 5 years ago, not just 3 years ago. But but that's the background noise of, for some of us, our whole careers. I started as pastor in 2013, right?
That's just life, right? That's just life as a pastor, and you see that attitude from people of, well, but you knew what you were getting into.
No.
You knew what you were getting into. You knew what you were signing up for. You knew it was going to be hard, but we didn't. Not to this degree. Not to this degree.
And so that shows that this gives numbers to something that we're going to give narrative to, that something happened to us. We went through a thing, right? And there is real trauma from that. On top of that, we're living in a much more divided country. where it is just harder to stand up in front of people and say a thing, right? Fundamentally, like, proclamation is part of the job, whether you proclaim on a podcast or you proclaim in a sermon or however you do. Like, proclamation is a part of a pastor's job. It's like one of the core competencies. It's never been harder, or maybe not never, but it is extremely hard in this moment, on top of the trauma that we lived through, to then be able to publicly proclaim anything and be perceived as authoritative and neutral. Now, some pastors have given up. And neutral. Some pastors have given up.
Hard thing.
Yeah, have given up on the idea of neutrality, but then this is going to stray very close to bounds I don't normally talk about. I have political opinions. I have a degree in, not only do I have political opinions, I have a degree in political science. I don't bring them in to my work here. Not overtly anyways, right? You know, the closest I got is we hosted a, like, hey, people should vote event a week and a half back. That's as close as I get, because there's value in someone coming to you and knowing that you can be neutral to them, right? This is a pastoral care thing. Very few of us live in monocrop political congregations. Anyways, yes. So
that was a pitfall that I fell into when I first started preaching weekly. Yeah. And I really was trying to be very careful with my words. And apparently I was, because there were people on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And I remember very clearly one Sunday after I preached, I had each of them come up to me separately and go, "Ooh, I liked your sermon. I should send it to this political figure." And then the other side said, "Oh, I liked your sermon and what you said without saying it." And I said, "Oh, okay. That was not intentional." Yeah. But I didn't say any of those things. But they interpreted it as, you know, yes, and you're on my side of this political issue. And I, you know.
So there's a thing that's been blowing up in church world. It is this article by Alexander Lang, who up until very recently was the senior pastor at First Presbyterian of Arlington Heights. And he wrote a blog, he preached a sermon, but he wrote a blog post entitled Departure, Why I Left the Church. And so he's been in about as long as I have. He's 10 years. And he left the ministry, right? And a lot of it is what ministry turns out to be. Like, you know, what you think it is versus how it turns out. I love all the memes. It's like how it started and how it's going, right? Yes. And like that, you know, pastor, I think every pastor lives the how it started and how it's going meme. Some of it is this moment that we live in, right? There's a lot of trauma that is inherent to the job that doesn't necessarily get processed. Then it gets amplified by things like the pandemic and the political division that only makes it harder. Some of what he talks about is what I call the Matthew 10:36 problem, that one's foes shall be members of one's own household. You're basically he calls it the 1,000 bosses. You have 1,000 bosses, right? And he had a member of his congregation that was a state politician and said, no, I won't join church committee. It's too cutthroat. This is like, it was a state senator, right? Wouldn't join because it's too cutthroat, right? And like we live through that. And he also talks about that Christianity. And I think this is like, he is better at saying it than we are. Something that we touch on too, that like a fixed versus growth mindset, that a lot of young clergy, we got into this bit, or a lot of clergy got into this business. We want to change people, change the church, change the world. And most people in church pews have a fixed mindset. They just want what they want. They want to be retold and reconfirmed that how right they are, how comfortable they are.
They want to do it the way they've always done it, and they don't want to change.
Well, they want to feel good. They want to be reinforced that how they've always done it is the divine way.
Right.
Karl Barth would
that's just how God works.
Right. This is the like, Karl Barth, my favorite piece of Barth theology that is like, most of what we do in church is absolute shenanigans. It doesn't matter. It's all like it is. Whose line is it anyways? It is the games are made up and the points don't matter. until those very rare moments where Jesus breaks through. But most of the time we're worshiping ourselves and not God. And that's really comfortable. And so he's leaving. He gets into we're going to post it in the show notes. And so if no matter what platform you're watching it on, you'll have a link to his post. He wrote a poem at the end that talks about his time. It's very well written. But it touches on a lot of these pieces of why pastors are quitting. And some of it that he talks about, and this is something that I resonate with a lot, is what people see us do versus what this job is ludicrous, right? Like, yes. I get the joke that isn't funny. Don't you just work on Sunday? No. Because yeah, like I am the front man of a weekly show, right? I do a monologue. We call it the sermon. I write a monologue every week. I have about the same writing burden as John Oliver does. I have a writing burden of John Oliver, and I've got to then host the show, right? And so I've got to be, Mr. Personality, whatever. I happen to be a trained actor, and so that part's okay. Then he talks about you got to be the CEO, or Emily, in your case, the COO of a scrappy, mildly hopeless nonprofit.
Got to be the fundraiser. Got to be the counselor to the people.
Right, which means
have to show people grace and love, no matter how poorly they treat you,
no matter how badly they bludgeon you, and they will.
Yes.
And like you become, and this comes up in my marriage a lot, that I've become community secret keeper. And everyone assumes I tell Sydney, my wife, all the things that happen in the church. I don't, right? That like to the point where then I don't tell her things that she should know about friends and family. Like my friend of mine just had a kid and he had to spend some more extra time in the hospital. And then she would ask me like, hey, how's that kid? Oh, right. I'm supposed to tell you this medical stuff. Right. Because I have 10 years of just absorbing everyone's medical, everyone's deep tragedy, everyone's like, who is experiencing spousal abuse, I remember it distinctly, a day where you and I did a day of laundry so that maybe we could like help someone that was being abused,
alleviate the reason for abuse for a little while.
So that maybe they would have an opportunity to whatever,
But that's the part that it's really hard to explain. My mother was trying to explain my job to my grandmother the other day, and she was like, but I couldn't put it into words. Like, what do you do right now? Because even if you tell people you're a pastor,
right?
If you're not a pastor in the traditional sense, if you're a digital pastor, if you're, how do you tell people, but what do you do all day?
Right.
And what do you actually do? And
so he, Alexander Lane's that like all of these competent, I guess, his article is very well formatted. Dyslexic me can get there.
But on top of having to be this pillar of virtue, you have to be this example put on a pedestal by people, right?
Professional speaker, CEO, counselor, fundraiser. By the way, fundraiser of the people you're counseling. Human resources director. Yeah, it's what I did a lot of my day-to-day was like managing staff conflict. Master of ceremonies, which to me is the same as number one. And then, by the way, your personal morality must be above reproach. And I 100% echo that.
Yes. You must be transparent and honest and live with integrity, and everyone must know it.
Yeah.
All of the time.
All the time.
Yes. And, by the way, your family as well.
Uh-huh. God help you if you have a screaming 2-year-old, which I do.
God help your families. And I feel like there's a lot of parallel here between the Great Resignation of pastors and the Great Resignation of educators.
Yeah.
For the same reason, because there was this huge traumatic event of a pandemic. And you would think, after realizing how much teachers do, when people had to keep their kids at home, when they had to homeschool, when they had to, completely change the format of education for an entirety of almost part of a year. as teachers were trying to think outside the box and make sure that our children were still educated. And yet we came out on the other side of this pandemic without teacher raises, without teacher appreciation. We gave them a pat on the back for a little while.
And then the divided political structure has just dumped a lot of extra on teachers, right? Like my wife works for Houston Independent School District, and I guess I can talk about this. I'm not under the district's social media policy, but they're caught up in this. There are now schools in HISD where a teacher is on camera all the time.
Yes.
And if they deviate from the script, they will be talked to. Right? Anyways, it is...
Big Brother. This is 1984 in the classroom.
Yeah, literally.
Horrible.
And it has a suitably 1984-ish name called NES Schools, the new education system. It's great.
Yes.
It in no way sounds like authoritarian nightmares. So he gives really thoughtful expression to, I think, a lot what is happening to a lot of us, and certainly
many of us.
Right?
This article has been read over 130,000 times. Clearly it has struck a chord with people.
And it speaks to why now half of pastors have thought about leaving the business. Because some of it is just what you think this job is and what it turns out to be. It's just different, right?
Yes.
And some of that you either enjoy it or you don't, right? I happen to enjoy the business side. And so part of how I have stayed in the saddle for 10 years, is I happen to enjoy the business side. And so I spent a good chunk of the day bogged down in the business side. And that happens to be something I get life from. But not everyone does.
Right.
And certainly the, personalities that tend to go to seminary are not, there's not necessarily a clean crossover there. You also the expectations of you are also then expected to change the world. And by the way, you're subject to 1,000 bosses who may beat up on you, who may take a run at you, who may try to fire you. Not because of gross incompetence, but because they don't agree with your interpretation of scripture and then have thus declared you a heretic. And this happens with some regularity.
Yes.
I think about my own arc. So we were talking about this before the show. The actual lockdown was not the super traumatic bit. For me, it was the after, right? Because we were in rural East Texas. And so that meant that our lockdown had to end in May of 2020, whether we liked it or not. And frankly, we didn't.
We really didn't.
And
I was really pregnant at that time and was not really safe to come back to public meeting spaces.
And my immune system sucks. And I am a public health practitioner. I have a master's in public health. And I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this data and I'm going, this is about to break bad, y'all. But it turns out, the summer of 2020, it broke really bad. And we couldn't shut back down because we knew, to shut back down would to kill the church. We got trapped.
Politically, it would kill the church.
Would kill the church. We ended up having, to shut back down in December of 2020 because 15% of our church had COVID. And even that, we lost some major families. We lost some major families because we didn't open back up soon enough. And we lost some major families because we shut back down again and opened back up 3 weeks later.
Yep.
And even the nature, we tried to have all these precautions that then everyone immediately threw to the wind. And so I'm sitting here going, and this is pre-vaccine, this is pre any of that. And so that was when because we got pretty good at the digital ministry stuff.
The actual shutdown was not so bad. We did okay during that.
We did that was probably some of the psychologically healthiest I've been. And this might say a lot about this job and me, but that was probably some of the most psychologically healthy I've been in my adult life. I ran 6 days a week. I had never been home so much since elementary school. Elementary school was the last time I was home that consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And like that 12 for us was about 12 weeks. That 12 weeks weirdly, like, I lost weight. I didn't like my pandemic weight gain wasn't until after, right? Like I lost weight. So I was running, I was running like 25 miles a week or whatever. Like it was great.
You had more time for self-care. We were
Right.
not doing all of the other, it was the 100 bosses that we were, I mean, we were still accountable to, but it was not the all day, every day inundation.
But they didn't control my calendar, right? Like
right.
It wasn't like, and this is an important part of ministry, but it's a part that you forget is like, okay, so I had a thing that started at 7, or I had a thing that started at 6:30, right? And so the meeting got over at 7:30, 7:45, and then like 3 people needed to talk to me afterwards, which is important. And then just as I'm like sitting down in my office to either like finish a script or just pack up, someone comes into my office and needs pastoral care, and next thing I know, it's 10 o'clock.
Yep.
Right? As I say, as we're recording this at 8:55, right?
Right.
Like that's the stuff that for me went away during the lockdown.
Because everybody was home.
So I was home. So then on top of that, there is just the stress of knowing that what I'm doing is maybe just wrong, right? Because I am opening up a disease vector. And I know this, right? Like the science is pretty clear on that. And so that kind of stretch of May of 2020 to when I went on paternity leave on luckily for everybody, on January 6th of 2021. Lucky for my career, I did not preach the Sunday after January 6th because I went on paternity leave on the 6th. And I just ran a writer's room for other preachers for that Sunday because I didn't have to talk, and so I could just give some other writers some ideas. But yeah, I mean that was, to me, that's where the real pandemic trauma comes from. And then
that trying to open back up and keep your people safe and get your people back and right,
and that on top of this job is because of the 1,000 bosses who you have to love even as they make a run at you, right? Like there's always trauma in this job. We went through something that I think for everyone was traumatic, and that trauma was just played out in different ways. For some folks, it was the lockdown, or for some folks, the lockdown went on for way longer, right? They didn't meet for a year, and we were probably sometimes sitting there fantasizing about what would it be like to not. But like everyone's trauma is different,
right?
But like that merely, I think, where this great resignation comes from, is the high level. It's not low level. It's high level trauma of this job spiked. And then we come back from the pandemic into a hyper polarized where it just becomes almost impossible to talk in the world.
Say anything without having people interpret what you are saying into whatever double meaning they want it to fit.
Right.
And trying to twist it into their own words, into their own worldview, when you're really not trying to speak to a worldview, you're trying to speak to a heavenly kingdom.
And you have to figure out the exact ways to talk that doesn't set off the dog whistle politics.
Yes.
But that also tells the truth, right? Yes. Like Jesus just has some stances on some things. And, I would love to see, I guess we know what happened to Jesus. They killed him. Right.
And so is your next sermon going to be the one that gets you run out of town with a pitchfork and, or not?
Right.
But if you're not preaching that, then are you doing your duty as a pastor to bring the authentic word of God to people?
And on top of that, by the way, your personal morality still needs to be above reproach.
Yes.
Right. And that's where, if we tend to be fairly religious people. And so things like integrity matter. There's probably great ways to make money in this business, but most of them lack integrity. And so Alex Lang gives expression to, I think, something that we've all talked about this before at our previous church. At the beginning of our work, I watched, 50% of the church leave in 6 months, right? Like we built it back into something really beautiful, but I got dumped every week for 6 months, right? From like June, I came in June of 18 until, end of 18 into early 19. I was just getting dumped all the time. And it was often, almost never was, it's just us. No, it was often, no, it's you. You, pastor, are the one killing this church, and that's why we're leaving.
Specifically.
Yeah, specifically.
It's very, very personal. It's very, very personal. It's not business. No, it's you. It's personal.
No, I mean, I got told more than once that like I drove the Holy Spirit out of the building, which, man, if I had that power, holy cow,
because you have the power of God.
What an ability. Like Moses could receive God. I can literally drive God out. I have stopped the unstoppable force. Holy cow. Right. But
for heaven's sake.
And like, I would love if that's the exaggeration. It's not. That is literally. And this went on, some version of went on this even through the pandemic. It wasn't until essentially right middle of the pandemic, kind of end of 2020, that cycle finally ended. But that was 2.5 years of my life. And so like, this isn't about me processing my trauma. This is merely to say like, I get it. And if we're going to build this thing, like there's a couple of things. Some of it is like, easy for me to say as a pastor, like, have realistic expectations for humans who happen to be clergy.
Remember that your pastor is a person as well. Stop putting them on a pedestal and start supporting them and standing behind them. Remember and helping them when they need them.
The Bible only has like one perfect person. Right? Like you could say be like Moses. Okay, so like fail sometimes and doubt sometimes and get really mad sometimes. Oh, be like a human who is a clergy. Or be like Elijah. Okay, fine. So like get really depressed. This is me. The more likely. Get really depressed, like wander in the wilderness, maybe lose the will to live for a minute, get nursed back to health, right? Like, okay,
take a nap and eat, and then feel better about life. Right?
Yeah, like it's like lying in the desert being fed by angels. Okay, pick a biblical figure, right? Like no one be like David, please. Fidelity, friends. Fidelity
matters. Yes.
Fidelity matters. Don't kill your general, right? Like, even the ones we think of as relatively better, like Joseph or Esther, right? Like they are also not perfect. Esther has to be prompted by Mordecai to do what she did. I named
multiple times.
I named it child Esther after Esther, right? So I'm not degrading Esther or Moses or Joseph or any. Joseph, incredibly braggy teen, grew up, but But
braggy. Even these great characters needed prompting, needed encouragement, needed people behind them standing in their corners saying, "You got this. Let's go do this."
Right.
Peter, this is what God wants you to do, so let's go do it.
Peter denied Christ 3 times. Famously, Paul had a past of trying to kill Christians and occasionally absolutely loses it. Galatians. And Paul deals with people trying to drive him out of ministry, people trying to, talk down to him. Paul had 10,000 bosses. Right? Paul had the 1,000. Read the letters alongside Acts. Paul had the 1,000 bosses problem too. Some of so part of why I try to tell the biblical stories the way I do is because I think it's what the Bible says. But some of it is also so we start to have reasonable expectations of each other. Because if we don't have people to lead these churches, because we've run them all out of town or traumatized them.
Expected too much of them.
That's not going to work. But the other part of it is, and this is something I really resonated with Alexander Lang's argument, is we need to be open to a growth mindset because we need to do something different. just celebrating our correctness will not save the world. Right? That's actually, like, not to be whatever, but I'm going to be. This is our show. That's what the Pharisees get wrong. Right? Like, the Pharisees, biblically, phenomenal, right? Paul will tell you that. They believed that, we should follow the law really well and then not get sent into exile, which is an admirable goal. A lot of what Jesus says actually echoes what the Pharisees themselves would say. But the Pharisees became self-congratulatory of how right they are, and they began to shun people who were not considered so right, like lepers and women with interesting pasts and sinners and tax collectors, the people who failed. And they began to exclude them. And so Jesus would eat with them, and they would freak out because those people are wrong. This is not how it's supposed to be. And Jesus like, no, dog, you are congratulating yourself in your rightness so much that you've become wrong. And so, I get this really is, I have dealt with, read that article and realize that, like, I read that article and I see myself in it. Like, I have had so many, he writes a better poem than I could ever write, but, like, I have had those thoughts. I have lived those moments. He just puts it better than I can. And so part of this show is maybe our own version of how to not resign.
How to not do that. How do we continue in spite of that? Right? How do we work in spite of the working conditions, right? How do we remember that our goal is bigger than ourselves, right? And how do we remember that God still got this?
And I don't want to take away from him leaving. Like, it sounds like he made the right choice for him. And I think a lot of pastors who I have seen, I'm in the middle of writing my piece for next week. And, I'm going to talk about we're actually doing the church conflict tease for next week. We're doing the church conflict passage in how to settle church conflict passage in Matthew 18. And I'm writing about a friend of mine who was a pastor, went to seminary with me, and is now an agnostic, right? Not just left the ministry, left the church, in part because of their experiences of being a pastor. And so some of this is a larger pitch, but some of this is, like, can we shift this conversation to being about not letting go of our message, but growth and change?
Right.
Can we restart this thing?
Can we innovate enough? Can we be flexible enough? It's the F word, right? Flexibility. Yeah. We call this a dirty word sometimes, but really we have to be flexible. We have to be willing to move where the Spirit is moving.
Right, because you want the pastor. You read the profiles, right? You want the pastor that can, save the church. And a lot of that gets placed on us, right? Like, drive the numbers up, right? Even in a world that is becoming less religious and more secular. Drive the numbers up. And then you come with the pitch to, not because the numbers aren't the thing. It's about relationships. But, like, to build those relationships. And they go, well, that's too different. What about my thing? And I'm like, one or the other, friends. One or the other, right? Well, we've always done it this way. Great. How's that going? And is the people... This is an open question. This is an open question in my own life, right? As I watch friends of mine also undergo the Great Resignation. It's an open question as to whether the people with the mindset to change this thing will stick around in things that look like modern churches, or will they just leave, go do their own thing, and out of that will come a whole new thing, right? The church itself will never die. It's the Spirit of God moving in the world, right? We'll talk about that a ton next week. But it's an open question. What do we do? And can we do it? And so if we're going to restart this thing, if we're going to make it, read Alexander Lang's thing, Peace. and understand that like this represents what a lot of us go through. And it's not really just about us, but like we need leaders to lead this thing.
And tune in next week because we're also going to have our friends from the Spiritual But Not Religious podcast. Speaking of people who are doing interesting things in the name of God, not necessarily in the walls of a church or in the organization of the church, because of exactly that. It's not just pastors, friends. It's everybody. Yeah. So tune in next week for sure. It's going to be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, and that's as good a place as any. We've ran long. We talked a lot about all the trauma. I feel like we've all grown as people.
Had a good therapy session during this. We processed some things.
And whatever. I had a seminary professor's like, hey, you can talk about your stuff as long as you're not doing it to live process it, right? Do it with a purpose, right? This is us trying to echo like what's driving this great resignation. It's real. And it is a risk. Anyways, if you have feedback for us, you can email us at thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. It's thegoodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. You can also post comments on any of the things. This goes up on Facebook. This goes up on YouTube. This goes up on our website, all of which is Servants Now. Our TikTok has happened. So we have a if you want like short, punchy takes on the pod, you can at Servants Now on TikTok, on Instagram. We're all over the worldwide, man. It's amazing. This show and everything else we do here is product of the Servants Now Media Lab at Servants of Christ United Methodist Parish, deep in the heart of Southeast Houston, and is made possible in part by an Innovators Grant with the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you want to see all the things that we are doing, go to all of those places. It's Servants Now everywhere. But also, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll see you next week.